Have you ever found yourself wondering who really calls the shots? Behind the scenes,
Mhm.
behind the headlines, the products you buy, maybe even the big global events unfolding.
Hmm.
We hear a lot about politicians, CEOs, right?
Mm.
They're the faces we see. But what if there's this quieter, almost invisible power operating, something woven right into our financial system?
Yeah, something more pervasive.
Exactly. So today, on the deep dive, we're really going to plunge into something that, honestly, it could reshape how you understand power in the 21st
It's
century.
a big topic.
It is. We're going to unpack the unprecedented influence of what people call the big three asset managers. We're talking about BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street.
Right. Those names keep popping up.
They do. And on the surface, their job seems pretty simple, right? Managing savings, pension funds, retirement accounts for millions of people.
Like handling your 401k or something.
Precisely. But as we're going to explore today, their reach, it goes way beyond just personal finance. They seem to exert this profound and often, frankly, unacknowledged control over huge sectors, media, defense, even the workings of democracy itself.
Quite a claim.
It is, and our deep dive today is mainly drawing from this really insightful book. It's called Empire by Shareholder, How the Big Three Asset Managers Control War, News, and Truth in the 21st Century.
Yeah.
The author is Skylar Fiction.
Okay.
And alongside that, we're looking at, a whole bunch of supporting academic work reports, things from the Sage Encyclopedia of Mass Media and Society, the Journal of Finance, SciPRI, those U.S. House Select Committee reports, studies from places like Yale and Harvard, too.
So solid sources, not just one book's opinion.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
Our mission today is really to cut through the, let's face it, often confusing financial jargon. We want to give you a clear, informed understanding of this whole area. It's often overlooked, but we're hoping for some real aha moments, things that might shift how you see the world working.
Yeah, absolutely. What we're looking at today, it's a critical and I think a genuinely fascinating exploration of modern power. It's about how this institutional capital, especially the huge amounts managed by these three firms, has just quietly grown to shape our world.
Quietly is the key word there, isn't it?
It really is, in ways most people just don't fully realize. It's a system where, financial muscle isn't just about making money anymore. It translates directly into this widespread influence. It touches pretty much everything: the news you read, the shows you watch, even the big geopolitical events that define our times.
Okay, so let's dive in. Let's unpack this. Who are these big three firms, really, and just how much clout do they actually have?
Right. So BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, they're the absolute titans of asset management. These are the companies that gather up money from all over the place.
Like where?
Well, it could be your personal 401k, like we said,
Yeah.
or massive state pension funds, university endowments, even sovereign wealth funds from other countries. They pool all this capital together,
Okay, huge pools of money.
colossal pools. And then they invest that money on a truly massive scale across the entire global economy.
So they buy stocks and bonds everywhere.
Pretty much. But it's crucial to get this. They don't make cars, they don't write software, they don't deliver pizzas. Their business is managing the money itself and acquiring ownership stakes through those investments. That's their game.
Got it. So they're intermediaries in a way, but powerful ones.
Extremely powerful. And the sheer scale of their influence, it's staggering, frankly. The main source book, Empire by Shareholder, points out that back in 2019, these three firms together were the largest shareholders in something like 88% of all the companies in the S&P 500.
Wait, 88%.
88%. Just let that sink in. Almost every major public company in the U.S., think about the tech giants, the media networks, the big banks, manufacturers, one of these three firms is likely its biggest institutional owner.
Wow.
And the total amount of money they manage, their assets under management, it's over $20 trillion.
$1 trillion.
Yeah.
That number is just, it's hard to even wrap your head around.
It really is. To give you some perspective, that's more financial firepower than the entire economy, the GDP of almost every single country on Earth. Only a tiny handful of nations have economies bigger than the assets managed by just these three firms.
That's an insane concentration of capital.
It's immense, almost unfathomable, really.
So, okay, $20 trillion.
Hmm.
It sounds like they're just investing money for people, like a service. But how do firms that aren't actually making anything wield such deep power?
That's the key question, isn't it?
Yeah. I think the common idea is that they're just passive investors, right? They hold the shares, collect dividends, but they don't meddle in the companies. Is that fair?
Well, that's the perception. But our sources, they really push back hard against that idea.
How so?
As the Sage Encyclopedia of Mass Media and Society puts it very bluntly, ownership is power. Simple as that.
Ownership is power.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this isn't just about getting a share of the profits. It's crucially about their power to vote. They get to vote on who sits on the company boards. They influence major corporate policies. They have a say in how much the top executives get paid.
Right. The shareholder votes.
Exactly. So imagine BlackRock owns, say, 6% of a huge defense contractor. Or maybe Vanguard owns 7% of a big media conglomerate. They might not be writing the new script themselves or designing the next fighter jet.
But they have a big say in who does get hired to do that.
Precisely. And they have influence over the overall strategic direction those companies take. They are very actively involved in proxy voting.
That's proxy voting.
Yeah, that's where shareholders vote on company matters. These firms routinely cast votes on thousands, literally thousands of these ballots every single year. And by doing that, they are quietly shaping the leadership, the strategy, the direction of corporations that, influence global conflicts, national politics, public opinion, everything.
That does not sound passive at all.
Not in the slightest. It's active influence, just exercised through a different mechanism than direct management.
And there's another layer here too, right? The way they're all kind of connected.
Yes, that's another fascinating part. Their interconnectedness really compounds their influence. It creates what some scholars, like Schmaltz, Azar, and Taku, they call it an oligopoly of influence.
An oligopoly of influence. Okay, what does that mean?
It means it's not just that the big three own big chunks of most major companies out there. They also own significant stakes in each other.
Wait, they own parts of each other? BlackRock owns Vanguard stock, and Vanguard owns BlackRock stock.
Essentially, yes. Through the various funds they manage, this kind of circular ownership really blurs the lines we normally expect between competitors. It suggests that firms we think of as independent might actually be governed by these overlapping masters.
So they have shared interests even if they look like rivals.
Exactly. Think about the media sector. BlackRock and Vanguard are among the biggest institutional shareholders in giants like Comcast, that's NBC, right?
Yeah.
And Disney, which owned ABC, and Fox, and Warner Bros. Discovery, which owns CNN.
Wow, all the big names.
All of them. These are companies supposedly offering diverse viewpoints, representing different sides of the conversation. But when you peel back the onion, they're ultimately accountable to the same major financial players.
The same overlords, financially speaking.
Right. And this common ownership, it can lead to a sort of convergence of interests. It's much more subtle, maybe more pervasive than any kind of explicit agreement or conspiracy. It just aligns their incentives in a particular way.
And this concentration, this didn't just happen randomly, did it? The sources link it to policy decisions.
And absolutely. Our sources connect it directly to decades of deregulation. The 1996 Telecommunications Act is often cited as a major turning point.
The 96 Act, what did that do?
Well, basically, it removed a lot of the barriers that used to prevent just a few companies from dominating the media landscape. One source notes how this act allowed a few corporate conglomerates to essentially take control over almost every form of media: radio, TV, newspapers, magazines, movies.
So it paved the way for these huge media giants to form.
Precisely. And the consequences have been pretty significant. These conglomerates, all heavily backed by institutional investors like the big three, they didn't just merge companies, they centralized control over the editorial side.
Meaning fewer independent voices.
Fewer independent voices, yeah. And often, this led to cuts in expensive, sometimes risky investigative journalism. It's cheaper to produce opinion shows or infotainment, and it led to a homogenization of political coverage, making sure it aligns with the broader financial interests of the shareholders, protecting the bottom line.
So thinking about the listener, what does this fundamental shift actually mean for you? How does it affect your daily life?
Well, it means the whole structure of how media operates today directly impacts the information you receive, the perspectives you're exposed to, the narratives that shape how you understand what's happening in the world.
It sets the stage then. This financial power, this structure,
Yeah.
it ripples outwards. And the first big impact is on how we get our news, our information. Okay, this is where it gets really fascinating for me. We're talking about how this financial power, this ownership structure, translates directly into shaping our perceptions. Through the media we consume every day.
Right.
The source material basically argues that even though it looks like we have tons of, like liberal channels versus conservative ones, legacy media versus online startups, most of the U.S. media is ultimately owned by just a tiny handful of conglomerates.
Very small number.
And those conglomerates are, in turn, largely owned by the big three. So the implication is, whether you're watching Fox News or CNN or maybe MSNBC, you're talking about the same underlying major shareholders. What does that actually mean for the news we end up getting? Does it really change things?
It means that this illusion of choice is incredibly powerful in today's media world. As of the 2020s, just 6 corporations, think Comcast, Disney, Warner Bros., Discovery, Paramount Global, News Corp, and Sony, they control the vast majority of U.S. media platforms.
6 companies.
Wow. 6. And when you look at the specific ownership data, it's really quite stark. For instance, Vanguard holds the largest single stake in Fox Corp that's over 13%.
13% of Fox.
Yep. And they also own over 8% of Comcast, nearly 8% of Disney. BlackRock usually holds somewhere between 4% and 5% of each of these giants. And State Street has significant voting power right across the board, too.
So cable news, streaming services, websites, the same big investors are behind them.
That's the financial reality. And that reality, as the source argues, it creates a potentially dangerous homogeneity. A sameness in content and perspective, even when it doesn't look like it on the surface.
Yeah, dangerous homogeneity. That's a strong phrase.
Yeah.
How does that actually play out? What do we see, or maybe not see because of it?
Well, think about it. This cross-ownership, where the same institutions own stakes in multiple media outlets, it almost guarantees that profit comes before, say, genuine diversity of thought.
How so?
Investigative journalism, for example, it's expensive, it takes time, it can be legally risky, it might upset powerful people or advertisers, people who might also be connected to those same investors.
Right. Safer to avoid rocking the boat.
Exactly. Opinion-based infotainment, on the other hand, it's cheap to produce, and let's be honest, it often gets more clicks, more views, it can be quite addictive.
True.
Our sources describe the modern newsroom not as a temple of inquiry anymore, but more like a content mill feeding a corporate algorithm. The focus shifts.
So it's not just about one owner telling journalists what to write.
Not usually, no. It's more subtle. When the same financial institutions own the platforms delivering the news, it influences the bigger picture, the structural decisions.
Like what?
Like which news divisions get the most funding, what kinds of stories are deemed brand safe, who gets hired for the top jobs, the editors, the executive.
Okay, so it's about setting the overall direction and constraints.
Precisely. Through things like annual shareholder meetings, where these firms vote on who sits on the board, approve corporate strategies. They can shape everything from newsroom mergers and layoffs to advertising policies, even which digital platforms get prioritized. Over time, this quietly molds the version of reality presented to the public.
Can you give an example of this in action?
Yeah, the Sinclair Broadcast Group situation back in 2018 is a really stark one. Sinclair owns hundreds of local TV stations across the U.S.
Right, I remember that.
They were found to be distributing these pre-written, must-run editorial segments. They had clear political slants.
And the local news anchors had to read them?
Yes. The anchors, who people in the community trust, looked like they were giving their own independent views, but they were actually reading scripts dictated from Sinclair's corporate headquarters. Scripts warning about fake news, ironically, while delivering centrally mandated content.
And who were Sinclair's major investors then?
Top investors included Vanguard and BlackRock. It's a clear example of how that financial influence can trickle down and result in a homogenized message, even at the local news level, which people tend to trust more.
That Sinclair example is genuinely disturbing. It really highlights how fragile that appearance of journalistic independence can be. And things get even more complex now in the digital age, don't they, with algorithms and all that?
Oh, absolutely. Algorithms are now the gatekeepers for many people's news feeds. And what are algorithms designed for?
Engagement. Keeping it clicking, watching, scrolling.
Exactly. Maximizing engagement. So clicks become the currency. And unfortunately, sensationalism, outrage, even misinformation often generates more clicks than nuanced factual reporting. It can be monetized faster than it can be debunked or corrected.
Which means the institutional investors, who are ultimately driven by maximizing financial returns,
they have very little inherent incentive to push the platforms they own towards prioritizing journalistic integrity if controversy and polarization are driving higher ad revenue and better stock performance. It sets up a really perverse dynamic.
where what's profitable can be the opposite of what's true or good for public understanding.
Precisely. And beyond just the content itself, media firms are fundamental gatekeepers for political discourse. They frame the narratives. They decide which issues get covered and how.
Around big things like war, the economy, foreign policy.
All of it.
Yeah.
So think about this. When defense contractors like Lockheed Martin or Raytheon companies, where the big three hold massive stakes, remember when they get consistently positive or uncritical coverage during periods of military buildup or conflict?
You have to ask the question.
You have to ask,
Yeah.
is this straightforward journalism, or is it closer to public relations, maybe even unintentionally? The line gets incredibly blurry, and transparency about these financial ties is usually lacking.
So if the big three aren't directly ordering editors to kill stories, what does this influence actually look like day to day? We talked about the subtle pressures, the funding decisions. But what about the stories that just never get told?
That leads into this concept the source calls structural censorship. It's not like an old school government censor stamping rejected on an article.
Right.
It's quieter. It's about omission. Stories that just don't get assigned, questions that don't get asked, angles that aren't pursued because they might cause trouble.
Trouble for whom?
Trouble for the parent company, trouble for advertisers, trouble for powerful people connected to the shareholders. It's about risk avoidance.
And the power lies in not having to intervene directly.
Exactly. That's what the source calls the power of non-intervention. If you run a media outlet and you know your biggest shareholder is, say, Vanguard, and Vanguard also owns huge stakes in the banks or the oil companies or the tech firms you might investigate,
You're going to think twice before publishing something really critical.
you might. You might preemptively avoid rocking the boat. Maybe you tone down an expose. Maybe you don't follow up on a whistleblower's claims quite as aggressively. Maybe you just stick to safer topics.
It's not a conspiracy then, but more like
Yeah.
the system incentivizes caution.
It's an ecosystem that rewards playing it safe, maintaining brand safety, which ultimately protects the broad portfolio interests of those big asset managers. It leads to what's described as editorial caution as capital logic.
Editorial caution is capital logic.
Reporters learn the boundaries, editors internalize what's acceptable, and you end up with this incentive-aligned silence. Certain topics just become too risky to touch.
There was an anecdote in the source material about this, wasn't there? A journalist trying to publish something.
Yes, a really telling one from 2023. A journalist had an expose on how certain mutual funds were investing in surveillance tech firms used by authoritarian regimes. Important story, right?
Yeah.
Well, the piece got delayed, then heavily edited, then ultimately it was killed. Officially, the reasons given were vague things like potential advertiser sensitivities and unclear reputational alignment.
But the unstated reason.
The likely unstated reason: Vanguard, one of the big three, had significant ownership stakes in both the surveillance firms being investigated and the media conglomerate that employed the journalist.
Wow. Censorship without fingerprints.
That's exactly what the source calls it. It's subtle, deniable, but incredibly effective. And this dynamic isn't just limited to commercial media. Even public broadcasting, nonprofits like NPR, PBS, ProPublica, they're not totally immune.
How so? They don't have shareholders in the same way.
They don't, but they rely heavily on donations, often from large foundations or wealthy philanthropists, and many of those donors serve on the boards of or invest through the same big corporations that the big three also own.
So there's still an indirect connection.
An indirect and often complex web of connections. It's not necessarily nefarious, but that funding reality inevitably shapes, perhaps subconsciously, the range of topics they cover, the critical angles they take. The watchdog, even the nonprofit one, can end up behaving more like a well-fed pet.
So it's not just what's reported, it's what's not reported. The silence, the subtle pressures that lead to self-censorship. And ultimately, we're left with a media landscape where, because media and financial power share the same portfolios, the watchdog is less likely to bite the hand that feeds it, even indirectly.
And the public, mostly unaware of these deep financial entanglements, might just assume that if they're not hearing strong criticism, there must be nothing much to criticize.
But that's not necessarily true. It could just mean the system learned to silence dissent quietly, to, as the source puts it, price truth out of existence.
A chilling thought.
It really is. And this shift in power, this ability to shape perception through media, it connects directly to another really sobering area: how these same financial interests stand to profit from global conflict. Okay, this next part is, frankly, quite disturbing. We're shifting focus to how war itself isn't just a matter of geopolitics or national security anymore. It's also presented as a profit engine.
A very lucrative one for some.
And the gears of that engine, according to our sources, are greased by the very same shareholders managing, your pension, my retirement account. It's a stark connection.
It is. The argument is that the whole machinery of modern warfare, we're talking missile contracts, global surveillance systems, battlefield robotics, cybersecurity expansions, it's all deeply woven into the investment portfolios of the big three.
So they don't pull the trigger.
No, they don't fire the missiles, but they potentially profit every single time one is launched or a new defense system is sold.
Let's get specific here. The sources name names, right? Which defense contractors are we talking about and who owns them?
Yeah, the book goes into detail. Take Lockheed Martin, they're the world's largest defense contractor. They make the F-35 jets, among many other things.
Okay, major player.
Huge player. And they're top institutional shareholders. BlackRock and Vanguard. They collectively own billions of dollars worth of Lockheed stock.
Billions.
And the pattern repeats. Raytheon Technologies, they specialize in missile defense systems. Top shareholders, Vanguard holding over 8%, and BlackRock with nearly 7%.
Wow.
Northrop Grumman, they're big in nuclear weapons, autonomous drones like the Global Hawk, again, top shareholders. Vanguard with about 8.6%, BlackRock with 6.4%. General Dynamics, another giant Vanguard, holds almost 8%, BlackRock about 5%.
So these aren't small stakes. These are significant ownership positions across the entire defense industry.
They are far from trivial. They represent massive financial investments. And crucially, they also translate into significant voting power on corporate boards, influencing strategy and executive decisions.
And these companies aren't just selling to the U.S. military, are they?
Not at all. They have a huge export market. They sell weapons and military technology to over 100 countries worldwide, and that includes regimes with, let's say, very questionable human rights records.
So the profits flowed regardless of who's buying.
The market is global. SPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, reported in 2022 that the U.S. accounts for nearly 40% of all global arms exports. 40%. Far more than any other country.
So every missile fired, every drone strike, every fighter jet sold. It's a transaction in this huge global marketplace.
A marketplace where the big three are deeply, deeply invested. So inevitably, whenever geopolitical tensions rise, whenever there's a conflict or the threat of one...
Then stocks often go up.
Exactly. Which directly benefits these major shareholders. It creates a direct financial incentive tied to conflict and instability.
It's quite unsettling to see that direct line drawn. The same names BlackRock, Vanguard owning huge chunks of the companies making the weapons used all over the world. And it's not just a passive benefit, is it? There's talk of a feedback loop.
Yes, the sources describe this disturbingly elegant, self-reinforcing cycle.
How does it work?
Okay, think about it like this. Step one, the media companies, which, as we just discussed, are often owned by these same financial institutions. They shape public opinion, often framing narratives that justify military intervention or increase defense spending.
That's setting the stage.
Step two, politicians whose campaigns are often heavily funded by political action committees, PACs, associated with these defense contractors and their investors, they respond to that public sentiment or perceived threats and call for action. They authorize spending, approve contracts.
Which benefits?
Step three, the defense contractors get lucrative government contracts. Their revenues and profits go up.
And step four?
Step four, the asset managers, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, see the value of their investments in those defense stocks rise. They gain significant returns.
And who pays for all this?
The public pays through taxes that fund the defense budget, and then the cycle often repeats itself. It's a loop where financial interests, political action, and media narratives reinforce each other.
And the sources suggest the big three aren't just passive beneficiaries here. They actively encourage this.
Research cited in the book by scholars like Ben David suggests that this kind of institutional ownership has a measurable impact on corporate lobbying intensity, especially in sectors like defense and energy, where government policy is everything.
So BlackRock and Vanguard actually vote in ways that increase lobbying.
They often vote in favor of executive compensation packages that reward aggressive growth and market expansion, which in the defense sector often means more sales, more contracts. They can also pressure companies to maintain or even increase their lobbying budgets to ensure favorable regulations and appropriations. They're not just observers, they are active participants, shaping the environment that generates these returns.
The war in Ukraine seems like a really clear, recent example of this whole dynamic in action.
It's a stark case study. Since Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, defense stocks, particularly those of U.S. contractors, have soared. NATO countries ramped up spending. Demand for American weapons systems skyrocketed.
And Lockheed Martin actually mentioned Ukraine in reports.
They did. In a March 2023 shareholder report, Lockheed explicitly cited the conflict in Ukraine as a key growth area. They specifically mentioned increased demand for integrated air and missile defense systems. It was framed purely as a business opportunity.
And at the same time, the media coverage.
Simultaneously, the U.S. media coverage of the war, mostly produced by companies owned by these very same investors, presented a narrative heavily focused on righteous resistance, the need for more advanced weaponry, and unstinting support.
Which raises that difficult question again. Is it purely journalism, or is it influenced even subtly by the financial incentives?
It's a question the sources strongly imply we should be asking. The book even includes a diagram it calls the unified power structure. It shows the big three at the apex, with arrows flowing down simultaneously to both major media conglomerates and major defense contractors.
Symbolizing that simultaneous influence.
Exactly. It drives home the point. The same institutions profit from both the weapons of war and the words that justify it.
When you connect all those dots, it paints a really different picture of war. It's not just policy. It starts to look like a business strategy.
Deeply intertwined with financial returns, absolutely. It really echoes President Eisenhower's warning back in 1961 about the military-industrial complex gaining unwarranted influence.
But this is different, isn't it?
It's like that complex has been privatized, maybe even outsourced, and as the source puts it, kind of wrapped in index funds now. It's less visible, perhaps more ingrained in the financial system itself.
And the implications for democracy seem huge.
Profound. If profit becomes a primary driver for war, and that profit is concentrated in the hands of a few institutional shareholders, then the motivation for military engagement can shift away from genuine national interest or security towards shareholder return.
So while the public is debating foreign policy,
While we debate on TV or online, the votes that really count might be the runs cast in corporate boardrooms, votes on budgets, on board appointments, on lobbying strategies. It's an unseen layer of decision-making.
and this isn't a partisan thing either, is it? Both parties are involved.
Completely bipartisan. Defense industry PACs, funded ultimately by the returns generated for institutional investors, contribute heavily to both Democratic and Republican campaigns. They hedge their bets.
So the system keeps going regardless of who's in power.
Largely, yes, and it gets even more complex. That 2023 Senate Intelligence Committee report highlighted how major U.S. financial institutions, including the Big Three, were channeling billions of investment dollars into Chinese companies with direct links to the Chinese military, despite ongoing geopolitical tensions and documented human rights abuses.
So investing in potential adversaries, too.
If the returns are good enough, it seems. It just highlights how financial logic can sometimes override political or ethical considerations.
Yeah.
This whole web of financial entanglement, it doesn't stop at war and media. It leads us directly into a broader ethical minefield, especially around the concept of ESG investing.
Right, ESG. Environmental, social, and governance investing. On the surface, this sounds like a really positive development, doesn't it? These huge asset managers seem to be trying to do good.
That's certainly the image they project.
They publicly champion ESG priorities. They talk about responsible investment, fighting climate change, promoting social justice. You see the glossy reports with pictures of wind turbines, diverse boards, happy children. It looks like they're pushing for a more ethical future.
The marketing is very effective, lots of greenwashing potential.
So where's the catch? Where's the contradiction the sources point to?
This is where the source introduces the idea of a moral laundering pipeline. The public face, the ESG branding, often stands in really stark contrast to where the money is actually going.
Okay, how so?
Well, the most glaring example discussed is the entanglement of U.S. asset managers with certain Chinese companies. That 2024 report from the U.S. House Select Committee on the CCP was pretty explosive.
What did it find?
It detailed how BlackRock and MSCI, a major index provider closely linked to BlackRock, had together facilitated billions of dollars in U.S. investment flowing into Chinese companies. Companies directly implicated in serious human rights abuses.
Like what kind of abuses?
We're talking about the systematic oppression of the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, the high-tech surveillance used against pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong, and the development of China's militarized artificial intelligence capabilities.
And which companies specifically?
Firms like Hikvision, a world leader in surveillance cameras, iFlyTech, involved in voice recognition and censorship tech. SMAC, a major semiconductor manufacturer linked to the military, these aren't obscure companies. They're major players tied directly to China's state security apparatus.
So despite all the talk about ESG values,
Yeah,
the money was flowing into companies involved in repression.
precisely. Even with Larry Fink, BlackRock's CEO, making famous statements like, climate risk is investment risk, billions from funds managed or indexed by BlackRock were being channeled into these operations.
Was this happening unknowingly? Through index funds where they don't pick individual stocks?
Sometimes it's through broad index funds, yes. But the report suggests that in many cases it was happening with full knowledge of the company's activities and their roles in repression. Vanguard and State Street have shown similar patterns. It's this dynamic the Select Committee called a moral laundering pipeline,
A role laundering.
meaning they publicly condemn human rights abuses and promote ESG values, while simultaneously profiting from investments in companies enabling those very abuses, often through complex, opaque investment structures that make it hard for the average person to track.
That feels like a massive disconnect. A fundamental hypocrisy almost.
It certainly raises critical questions about the true purpose and effectiveness of ESG as currently practiced. And this isn't just about investments in China. The hypocrisy is broader.
How else does it show up?
Many funds explicitly marketed as ESG or sustainable, managed by the big three, still hold significant investments in companies you might not expect. Major defense contractors, fossil fuel giants, companies with well-documented histories of labor violations or environmental damage.
So an ESG fund might still hold stock in, say, ExxonMobil, or Lockheed Martin, or Amazon.
Absolutely. A 2022 analysis cited in the source found exactly that. Many popular sustainable funds were still heavily invested in companies directly linked to warfare, high carbon emissions, or exploitative labor conditions. The label can be very misleading.
So how is this possible? How can they call a fund sustainable if it holds those kinds of stocks?
This gets to a core problem: the vagueness and inconsistency of ESG itself. There's no single universally accepted definition or set of legally binding standards for what constitutes ESG.
It's not like accounting rules.
Not at all. ESG scores, which funds often rely on, are typically generated by private rating agencies. And these agencies use different methodologies, weigh factors differently. One might focus heavily on carbon emissions. Another might prioritize board diversity. A third might give points for good PR or having certain policies on paper, regardless of real-world impact.
So a company could score well on one metric while being terrible on another and still get into an ESG fund.
Potentially, yes. It creates this kind of marketplace of ethics where companies can sometimes pick and choose which metrics to highlight. For the big institutional investors, ESG becomes less a tool for driving real change and more of a shield.
A shield? How?
It helps shield them from public criticism. It satisfies a growing demand from clients who want to feel like they're investing responsibly, and it enables massive marketing campaigns built around sustainability and positive impact. It's great branding.
But behind the shield.
Behind the shield, the fundamental imperative often remains the same: maximize financial returns, minimize risk, and accountability for the fund manager. Political scientist Anand Giridharadas has argued that modern capitalism excels at this, doing well by appearing to do good.
So ESG isn't necessarily pushing back against the empire of capital.
In this view, ESG is more like the empire's rebranding effort. It might make investors feel better, but it doesn't fundamentally challenge the system that produces the drone strike, the offshore oil rig, or the surveillance camera.
If the rulers of capital control both the weapons and the ESG brand.
Then challenging them effectively means exposing these contradictions, showing the gap between the glossy reports and the actual investment portfolios. That's where the real leverage might lie. And this concentration of power, this ability to shape narratives and manage perceptions, it goes right to the core of how our democracy functions, or perhaps doesn't function as we think it does.
Okay, let's talk about democracy. We all learn the basics in school, right? Government, for the people, by the people. Elections matter, public opinion matters.
The civics class version, yeah.
But this deep dive really suggests that's the, well, maybe only part of the picture. That beneath that familiar narrative, there's this other architecture of power, one defined by ownership, by lobbying, by huge flows of capital.
A hidden wiring system.
Exactly. And it raises the question, who's truly calling the shots? Is it really the voters, or is it the shareholders?
Yeah.
The source puts it starkly. The empire is not ruled from Washington. It is managed from Wall Street.
That's a provocative claim. How do they back that up?
It starts with challenging the idea that firms like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street are politically neutral. They always claim they are, right? Just managing money for clients, following the market, not taking sides.
That's their official line, yes. Passive and neutral.
But the book argues this neutrality is basically an illusion
Hmm.
in practice. Through their immense lobbying power, their control over proxy voting across thousands of companies, and the sheer weight of political contributions made by the companies they own, they become arguably the most influential unelected forces in American politics and policymaking.
Unelected influence, that's a key point.
They don't have to win votes in an election. They direct capital. And in the 21st century, the argument goes, capital often speaks louder than votes, wielding this pervasive influence without any direct public accountability.
And one major way this influence works is through something called regulatory capture, right? Can you break that down for us? How does it play into this?
Yeah, regulatory capture is crucial here. The source describes it as the quiet subversion of public institutions by private interests.
Okay.
Basically, the government agencies that are supposed to regulate powerful industries like finance, energy, media, become heavily influenced or even effectively controlled by the very industries they're meant to oversee.
How does that happen?
Through a few key mechanisms. There's the revolving door phenomena, people moving back and forth between jobs in regulatory agencies and high-paying jobs in the industries they used to regulate. There's intense lobbying pressure from industry groups with deep pockets. And there's the whole system of campaign finance, where politicians rely on donations from these same corporate interests. So the regulators and the regulated become too cozy.
Exactly. And the dominance of the big three as shareholders across all these major industries creates a whole new level of potential capture. You have just a few financial firms wielding disproportionate influence over both the private sector companies and the public sector agencies that are supposed to regulate them simultaneously.
That sounds like a recipe for conflicts of interest.
It creates what the source calls a self-reinforcing cycle of power. It goes like this. The asset managers use their votes to support corporate executives who favor deregulation and pro-shareholder policies.
Okay.
Those executives then ramp up corporate lobbying efforts to influence legislation in their favor.
Making it easier for them to operate with less oversight.
Right, which benefits the large shareholders, like the big three, who then use those increased returns to consolidate their ownership even further. The loop closes.
It's like a closed system almost.
Some scholars call it a meta-corporate governance system, where just a handful of institutional investors are effectively setting the rules of the game for entire industries, influencing both corporate behavior and public policy at the same time.
Can you give an example?
Think about BlackRock again. They are a top shareholder in nearly every major bank in the U.S., and also in nearly every major fossil fuel company, and also in nearly every major defense contractor.
Wow. Across all those critical sectors.
Yes. Now, all those companies, the banks, the energy firms, the defense contractors, they operate huge political action committees, PACs. These PACs donate millions to political campaigns. They fund think tanks that shape policy debates. They hire armies of lobbyists.
But who's ultimately behind those PACs, financially speaking?
While the PACs seem independent, representing ExxonMobil or JP Morgan Chase or Lockheed Martin, the argument is that their ultimate controllers, the ones benefiting from the policies they push for, are the major shareholders sitting behind that ownership curtain, the big three.
That's a powerful loop. And it sounds like it means our existing tools for controlling corporate power, like antitrust laws meant to break up monopolies, just aren't working in this new reality.
That's a major concern raised in the sources. Current antitrust frameworks are described as ill-equipped to address the systemic risks posed by common ownership.
Why? Why can't they tackle it?
Because the laws were mostly designed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to deal with single companies gaining too much market share in one industry, like Standard Oil controlling oil refining. They focus on individual firm dominance.
But the issue here isn't one company dominating, it's the same owners dominating multiple competing companies.
Precisely. So the big three can own significant stakes in supposedly competing airlines or competing banks or competing tech companies without triggering the traditional antitrust alarms. There's a technicality they exploit.
What's the technicality?
Because they classify their holdings as investments held for passive purposes, rather than actively managing the company's day-to-day, they often fly under the radar of laws designed to prevent one company from controlling another in the same market.
Even though their ownership clearly influences behavior.
Even though, as we've discussed, that ownership translates into huge soft power, influencing everything from healthcare prices to digital surveillance practices practices to climate change policies across entire sectors.
So when politicians do try to hold hearings about corporate abuses,
When they haul executives before Congress to talk about price gouging or privacy violations or environmental damage, the companies being questioned are almost always partly owned by these same institutional investors.
and do the investors divest? Do they pull their money out?
Rarely. They might issue statements expressing concern, they might engage in stewardship conversations behind closed doors, but actual divestment is uncommon. The profit engine keeps running.
And then there's the revolving door aspect you mentioned, people moving between these firms and government.
Yes, that's another key mechanism. The sources point to examples like former high-level BlackRock executives taking senior positions in the U.S. Treasury Department, the Federal Reserve, or serving as key economic advisors in presidential administrations, like Brian Deese under President Biden.
So when a crisis hits, like a financial crash or an energy crisis,
The government often turns to these very firms, or people formerly associated with them, for advice and solutions, which of course further embeds their influence and perspective within the policymaking process. It's not just lobbying from the outside, it's shaping policy from the inside.
and all this time, they're still casting those thousands of proxy votes every year.
Tens of thousands globally. And the voting records show they routinely vote against shareholder resolutions that might challenge corporate power proposals pushing for faster climate action, stronger labor rights, or reduced military contracting. Their votes tend to align with maintaining management control and maximizing shareholder value in the traditional sense.
And they spend directly on lobbying, too.
Oh, yes. BlackRock's lobbying spending in 2022 alone was reported at over $4.5 million, targeting key areas like financial regulation, climate finance rules, digital asset policies, and crucially, antitrust enforcement. They actively work to shape the rules of the game in their favor.
So putting this all together, what does it mean for democracy if this is how power works now?
The implication is pretty stark. In a healthy republic, citizenship is supposed to be the source of power. Your vote matters, your voice matters. But in what the source calls a shareholder republic, power increasingly flows to those who control assets, not necessarily those who have the best ideas or represent the public will.
Legislation responds to portfolios, not protests.
That's the concern. Even well-intentioned politicians can find themselves constrained by a system where almost every major institution, media industry, even parts of the legal system is intertwined with and influenced by these concentrated financial interests.
So it looks like democracy, but it functions differently underneath.
The source describes it as a potential simulation of democracy. The rituals are still there. We vote, we debate, we watch the news. But the actual levers of power, the ones that really shape outcomes on major issues, may have been quietly rerouted through corporate balance sheets, shareholder votes, and lobbying budgets.
We think we're participating, but the real decisions happen elsewhere.
The public watches the news, often produced by media outlets owned by these same interests, and believes it's informed. They cast their ballots believing they're exercising meaningful democratic power. But behind the curtain, the truly decisive votes might be the ones cast in boardrooms and shareholder meetings votes that determine corporate strategy, lobbying priorities, and ultimately, the direction of policy.
It's a sobering thought. We're taught to fear dictators who seize power violently.
But the source suggests the more enduring threat in our time might be those who acquire power quietly, legally, almost invisibly, through the mechanisms of the market itself. They don't need to overthrow the government.
They simply own everything, and they let the republic keep dreaming.
A powerful and deeply unsettling conclusion. And this whole system, this fundamental shift in power, is underpinned by that concept we keep circling back to. Common ownership. It affects everything.
Okay, common ownership. We've mentioned it several times, but let's really dig into it now. It sounds technical, maybe a bit dry, but the sources insist it has absolutely massive implications for, well, pretty much everything. Can you define it clearly for us again?
Absolutely. Common ownership is basically the situation where the same large investors, primarily the big three in this context, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, own significant chunks of stock in multiple companies that are supposed to be competitors within the same industry.
So owning stakes in Coke and Pepsi, or Ford and GM, or Verizon AT&T.
Exactly like that. Across almost every major concentrated industry you can think of. Now, traditionally, we assume investors want the companies they own to crush the competition, right?
Yeah.
To innovate faster, lower prices, grab market share.
Yeah, survival of the fittest. That's the free market ideal.
But common ownership completely changes that incentive structure. If BlackRock and Vanguard are major shareholders in all the big airlines or all the big banks or all the major pharmaceutical companies, their primary goal shifts.
Shifts from what to what?
It shifts away from wanting any one company to dramatically outperform the others, which might involve costly price wars or risky innovations. Instead, their main interest becomes the overall health, stability, and profitability of the entire industry or sector. They want the whole pie to grow steadily rather than fighting over slices.
Because they own pieces of the whole pie anyway.
Precisely. This fundamentally alters the dynamics of competition. It encourages cooperation or at least discourages aggressive rivalry.
So what are the concrete effects of this? If companies aren't pushed to compete as hard, what happens?
Well, the research suggests several negative consequences. First, there's less incentive for firms to innovate aggressively or invest heavily in research and development if they know their main rivals face the same ownership pressures.
Stagnation.
Potentially, yes. Or slower innovation. Second, there's less pressure to lower prices to gain customers. Why start a price war that hurts industry-wide profits when your largest shareholders own your competitors too?
So higher prices for consumers.
That's what studies suggest. Research by economists like Jose Azar at Harvard has found that even relatively modest levels of common ownership in industries like airlines and banking correlate with substantial anti-competitive effects. Things like reduced output, less capacity, and prices that tend to drift upwards towards monopoly levels, even without any explicit collusion.
So it's like a hidden monopoly. Not one company, but one set of owners controlling the market.
Exactly. The source argues that the concept of monopoly isn't dead. It's just been cleverly disguised. It's spread across portfolios. BlackRock doesn't have a monopoly on grocery stores, but it owns significant stakes in almost all the major chains. Vanguard doesn't just own Apple, it owns huge chunks of Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Meta.
Owning the whole game, not just picking winners.
That's the strategy. It ensures steady, predictable returns across their massive, diversified portfolios, rather than betting on risky competition.
Can you give us that airline example again? How does it play out there?
The airline industry is often cited as a classic case. The four largest U.S. airlines, Delta, United, American, and Southwest, all count the big three among their very top shareholders.
So the same firms own large pieces of all of them.
Yes, and critics argue this common ownership directly reduces the pressure on these airlines to truly compete on price or even significantly improve service. Why would Delta slash fares aggressively if it knows that will hurt the profits of United and American, whose shares are also sitting in Vanguard's and BlackRock's portfolios?
It dampens the competitive spirit.
It seems to. The result, arguably, is what many travelers experience. Persistently high fares for certain routes, lots of added fees, often mediocre service, and less innovation in the passenger experience. What looks like a market with four major competitors might, from the perspective of the dominant owners, function more like a cozy oligopoly.
And this pattern applies elsewhere too.
The sources argue yes. You can see similar patterns of consolidated ownership and potentially muted competition in sectors like pharmaceuticals, high drug prices, telecommunications, high mobile phone and internet bills, news media, homogenized content, as we discussed, weapons manufacturing, cloud computing, even healthcare services. Across the board, common ownership is reshaping industries.
It really turns that whole free market idea on its head, doesn't it? If the owners don't actually want fierce competition.
It fundamentally challenges the narrative. When the competitors share the same masters, the incentive is often towards stability, predictability, and maintaining healthy profit margins across the sector, not necessarily towards the disruptive innovation and price wars that benefit consumers.
And this connects back to that idea of structural censorship in the media too, right? How does common ownership facilitate that?
It reinforces it strongly. Remember, the power of non-intervention. If a media conglomerate knows its largest shareholders, the big three, also have massive investments in, say, the fossil fuel industry or the banking sector,
They're going to be very careful about publishing exposés that could hurt those industries.
they'll likely exercise editorial caution as capital logic. It becomes rational, from a business perspective, to avoid coverage that could alienate your biggest investors or harm their other holdings. You preemptively self-censor.
So reporters learn which topics are off-limits. Editors internalize the boundaries.
That's the dynamic described. It leads to that incentive-aligned silence. You don't need a direct order from BlackRock saying, don't run that story. The structure itself discourages it.
Like that journalist whose story got killed because of advertiser sensitivities and reputational alignment.
Exactly. That was likely code for, this story might anger the powerful institutions that own both us and the companies we're writing about. It's censorship without fingerprints, enabled by the web of common ownership.
When the media and the powerful industries share the same portfolio managers, the watchdog effectively becomes a lapdog.
A well-fed lapdog, perhaps, but not much of a watchdog. And the public, largely unaware of these underlying financial connections, might just assume the silence means everything's fine. No critique must mean no wrongdoing, which is a dangerous assumption.
And what about entrepreneurship, innovation? If the big players are all owned by the same entities who prefer stability, what happens to the disruptive startup, the little guy trying to shake things up?
That's another significant concern raised. In this kind of environment, genuine disruption isn't always welcome. It can be seen as a threat to the stable returns of the existing players.
So what happens to those startups?
They might face a few scenarios. If they become successful enough to pose a real threat, they often receive sudden, generous acquisition offers from the incumbent giants whose major shareholders, the big three, are happy to see the disruption contained by bringing it in-house.
Acquired and absorbed.
Or they might face other obstacles: aggressive legal challenges funded by the incumbents' deep pockets, difficulty accessing capital if they're seen as too disruptive to the established order, even potentially algorithmic disadvantages. Maybe their app doesn't get promoted as much, or their website doesn't rank as highly in search results controlled by tech giants with overlapping ownership.
So the system can kind of suppress threats.
It's described as a form of inertial capitalism. The system favors stability and the preservation of existing structures, often at the expense of truly radical innovation. And the big three benefit regardless because they own stakes in both the incumbents and often, eventually, the successful disruptors too.
And this relates to the rise of index funds, doesn't it? How they've changed things.
Absolutely. Index funds were marketed as a way to democratize investing, allow regular people to easily buy a slice of the entire market, diversify their risk, and participate in economic growth passively and cheaply.
Which sounds good in theory.
It does. But the unintended consequence, according to the sources, is that while millions of small investors own tiny, non-voting slivers of these index funds, the managers of those funds, primarily BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, consolidate immense voting power.
They control the votes for all those underlying shares.
Precisely. They're the ones who show up at the shareholder meetings, who engage with corporate boards, who vote on mergers, executive pay, environmental policies, lobbying activities. They've created a new kind of aristocracy, wielding power derived from millions of passive investors' savings.
How much voting power are we talking about?
The numbers are staggering. By 2023, it was estimated that BlackRock and Vanguard together controlled over 20% of the shareholder votes in more than 80% of all S&P 500 companies.
20% of the vote in almost every major company. Just two firms.
Effectively, yes. That's an incredible concentration of power over corporate America, exercised by unelected fund managers.
So the conclusion is, we were promised a free market, but we got something else.
The source puts it bluntly. We were promised a free market. Instead, we got a financial fiefdom run by the quiet kings of capital. The market isn't necessarily dead, but its direction seems increasingly steered by the portfolio strategies of a tiny number of dominant financial institutions, rather than by the invisible hand of genuine competition.
Okay, so if this is the reality we're facing, this immense, concentrated, often invisible power, what on earth can be done about it? It feels a bit overwhelming.
It's definitely a huge challenge, and the first hurdle is that our existing tools seem inadequate.
Like the antitrust laws we talk about. They just can't see this.
Pretty much. As we discussed, laws like the Sherman Act were designed for a different era, focused on single companies getting too big in one market. They weren't built to handle index funds or the subtle influence of common ownership across competitors.
So the legal framework is fighting yesterday's war, while the power structure has completely changed.
That's a good way to put it. The laws look at firm dominance, but the real issue now might be ownership dominance. Until regulators shift their focus from just looking at individual companies to looking at the patterns of ownership across companies, they're going to miss the bigger picture. Scholars like Posner and Weil argue this shift is absolutely critical.
Otherwise, the system remains blind to this new form of quasi-monopoly.
Exactly. And this blindness allows the soft hegemony of firms like BlackRock to continue. They can claim to be passive investors just managing index funds.
But that passivity comes with enormous voting power in nearly every major U.S. company.
Right. It becomes a form of subtle control. Even when they don't actively intervene, their sheer size and presence shape corporate behavior. Companies know who their biggest shareholders are and act accordingly, often choosing safer, depoliticized paths that prioritize capital preservation over potentially controversial public accountability.
Which leads to that idea of financial passivity becomes civic erasure. Their quiet presence erases certain possibilities.
That's the argument. It narrows the range of acceptable corporate behavior. And there has been growing scrutiny on this lately. In 2023, there were Senate hearings looking into whether these large asset managers were unfairly suppressing shareholder proposals they didn't like. There were congressional letters accusing the Big Three of potentially undermining U.S. interests by investing in those authoritarian-linked Chinese firms.
And so people are starting to notice.
There's definitely more awareness building, but the scale of the challenge is immense. And a huge part of the problem is public understanding.
Most people just don't know this is happening.
By and large, no. Most Americans probably couldn't tell you who the largest shareholder is in the company that makes their medication, or broadcasts their nightly news, or builds the military hardware used overseas.
And that ignorance isn't an accident.
The source argues it's actively cultivated. By the complexity, the opacity, the financial jargon, it all makes the system seem impenetrable, too difficult for ordinary people to grasp or question.
But awareness is growing. You mentioned investigations, activist groups.
Yes, definitely. Investigative journalists are doing crucial work mapping these ownership webs. Groups like the American Economic Liberties Project are pushing hard for regulatory reforms that specifically target common ownership and its anti-competitive effects. Grassroots campaigns are demanding more transparency from pension funds and university endowments about where their money is invested and how the votes are being cast.
But it's an uphill battle.
Hugely asymmetric. You have these three firms collectively managing over $20 trillion, operating globally, using sophisticated algorithms, influencing policy behind closed doors. It's a daunting adversary.
So where does change even begin? The source mentions asking a forbidden question.
Yeah, it suggests the starting point for the public is to ask a simple but powerful question: who profits from my obedience?
Who profits from my obedience?
Who benefits when I passively accept the news I'm given, the prices I pay, the wars fought in my name? Following the money, understanding who gains from the status quo, that's the first step towards challenging it.
Okay, so awareness is step one. What about actual solutions? What kinds of reforms do the sources propose to try and counter this concentration of power?
Several concrete reforms are discussed, though they all face significant political hurdles. One bold idea is forced divestiture.
Meaning making them sell off assets.
Specifically, limiting asset managers like the Big Three to owning significant stakes in only one major firm per industry. So they could own Delta or United, but not both. The idea is to forcibly break up the common ownership links and restore genuine competition.
That sounds radical. What else?
Another key proposal is voting power separation. This would basically strip the index fund managers, BlackRock, Vanguard, of the automatic right to vote the shares they hold on behalf of investors.
So who would vote?
The power would have to be passed through to the actual beneficial owners, the individuals in the pension funds or 401ks, perhaps through easier proxy voting platforms. Or maybe the default vote would be aligned with independent recommendations, not the fund manager's preference. The goal is to redemocratize shareholder voting.
Take the power away from the managers and give it back to the actual owners.
Exactly. Then there's a strong call for transparency laws, mandating much clearer, more accessible public disclosure of exactly what these funds own, how the asset managers are voting on key issues, who they're meeting with in government, and where their political donations are flowing, including through the companies they own. Sunlight as a disinfectant.
So we can actually see the influence network.
Right. And finally, a more structural idea is floated: creating public index funds.
Government-run index funds.
Potentially, yes, or publicly chartered nonprofit alternatives. These would offer low-cost index investing options similar to what Vanguard offers now, but they would operate under democratic governance structures with mandates for social accountability, not just profit maximization, offering a real alternative to the private oligopoly.
Those are some big ideas. But as you said, the resistance would be massive.
Immense. You're talking about challenging the core business model of some of the most powerful financial institutions on the planet. They would deploy vast resources to fight any changes that threaten their dominance.
Which leads to the idea that maybe reform isn't enough, that we need to think even bigger. The source talks about imagining a post-portfolio democracy.
Yeah. Yes, that's the final provocation. Maybe the problem isn't just that these specific firms are too big or too interconnected. Maybe the deeper issue is a system that inherently rewards concentration, silence, and conformity over genuine diversity, dissent, and democratic control.
So rethinking the system itself.
Rethinking the fundamental relationship between capital and democracy. If democracy is to survive and thrive in the 21st century, perhaps it needs to evolve.
Oh, what would that look like?
The book touches on possibilities like radically decentralizing ownership, pushing for models like worker cooperatives where employees own and govern their workplaces, or community land trusts, or strengthening public banks and credit unions that are accountable locally, not to Wall Street.
Shifting power downwards and outwards.
Exactly. It also means finding ways to reassert journalism's role as a true adversary to power, not just another product line within a conglomerate. That requires thinking seriously about new models for funding and structuring independent media. And maybe it involves building parallel economic structures, local currencies, B Corp, social enterprises that explicitly value community resilience, ecological sustainability, and human well-being over maximizing shareholder returns above all else.
These are fundamental shifts.
They are. It ultimately comes down to a fundamental choice, as the source frames it. Do we want a society ruled by silent shareholders or by living citizens? It's about deciding what values we want our economy and our democracy to serve. #tags outro.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive has really peeled back some layers on how power works today, hasn't it? We've traced how these big three asset managers, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, seem to wield this incredible, often unseen influence over our media, over global conflict, even over our democratic processes.
It's a complex web of influence, definitely.
And it's not the old-style command and control power. It's more subtle. That idea of structural censorship through financial incentives, the way common ownership dampens competition and creates this portfolio strategy rather than real market rivalry, it's a different kind of dominance.
Quiet, pervasive, built into the system itself.
Absolutely. And that final quote from the source material, Empire by Shareholder, really sticks with me. The idea that the end of democracy came through index funds, spreadsheets, and quarterly returns.
The chilling thought.
It continues. We did not see the empire form because it had no flag. We did not resist it because it had no army. It did not take our rights. It bought our silence and paid for it with our own retirement accounts.
That really sums up the core argument, doesn't it? How the very mechanisms designed for our financial security might have been turned into tools of control. The real question this leaves for you, the listener, is what does all this mean for how you understand power, for how you evaluate the information you receive? And what does it really mean to be an informed, engaged citizen in this new landscape?
Exactly. It's a lot to think about. In a world where, as the source suggests, truth itself can potentially be priced out of reach, bought in bulk, and effectively owned by shareholders, what's your role? What's our collective role in understanding this reality and maybe, just maybe, starting to reshape it? We really hope this deep dive has given you a new lens, a different way to look at the world around you, and maybe, just maybe, it's inspired you to keep asking those critical questions about who truly owns the future. Thank you for diving deep with us today.